in the Premier League.
We also have the best of Liam Halligan's Money Talks interviews, where Britain's top business leaders and policymakers discuss their careers.
First, though, here's the latest GB News with Ray Addison.
Thanks, guys. I'm Ray Addison. This is your news at 9 o'clock. Secondary school pupils in England are being advised to wear masks again to minimise the disruption caused by the Omicron strain. The move brings English schools in line with the rest of the UK, as the government says there are no excuses for children not to learn face-to-face. Education Secretary Nadhim Zahawi acknowledged the variant presents challenges. Professor Hugh Pennington thinks the decision will make some difference in tackling the spread.
Not the silver bullet to stop the transmission of the virus. It shows that something is being done, and there's going to be a relatively small but real reduction in transmission.
Boris Johnson wants ministers to develop robust contingency plans for workplace absences over fears that rising COVID cases could affect businesses. It follows reports that guidance to work from home in England could continue for most of January. Public sector leaders have been asked to test plans against worst-case scenarios of up to 25% workforce absence rates. 20 Conservative MPs and peers have written an open letter calling on the Prime Minister to tackle the spiralling cost of living. Those who signed the letter, which was published in the Sunday Telegraph, include 5 former ministers. They're proposing environmental levies are cut and VAT is removed from energy bills. The government says it's already taking steps to help the most vulnerable by making cold weather payments and changes to universal credit. School children in Scotland are being urged to get their second COVID jab before heading back to school. From tomorrow, youngsters aged 12 to 15 can go to a drop-in centre as well as bring scheduled appointments forward. The Scottish Government says an increase in vaccination capacity means jabs are being offered earlier than originally planned. Meanwhile, around 132 million coronavirus jabs were given last year amid the largest vaccine campaign in British history. Over 90% of people in the UK over the age of 12 have now had their first jab, and nearly 85% have had their second. The emergence of Omicron has also accelerated the rollout, with more than 1.6 million Brits getting their booster jab in the final week of 2021. The DUP has warned Liz Truss of major implications unless progress is made over the Northern Ireland Protocol. They want the Foreign Secretary to swiftly set a formal deadline to end negotiations with Brussels. DUP leader Sir Geoffrey Donaldson says a lack of rapid and decisive progress would impact the stability of political institutions. Ms Truss, who took over from former Brexit negotiator Lord Frost, says she remains prepared to invoke Article 16 if issues are not resolved. Commons Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle has called for all former Prime Ministers to be knighted. It's as the Queen made Tony Blair a Knight Companion of the Most Noble Order of the Garter. That's the oldest and most senior British order of chivalry. However, Sir Lindsay says all ex-Prime Ministers should receive the honour, as it's one of the toughest jobs in the world. Farmers are to be paid to help restore natural habitats to fill the gaps left by EU subsidies in new government plans. Environment Secretary George Eustice is set to announce 2 new schemes to rewild Britain, aiming to restore up to 300 hectares within 20 years. The Sunday Telegraph reports plans will include a local nature recovery scheme with funding to build new habitats, plant trees and restore wetland areas. And a new squad of detector dogs could help lower the risk of exotic diseases arriving in Scotland. The canines are specially trained to sniff out products of animal origin, such as African swine fever, which affects pigs, and foot and mouth disease. After robust training, the dogs are starting work at airports, ports and parcel hubs across the country. OK, that's your news update. I'll be back in half an hour with the latest headlines. Now let's return to the guys.
Thanks, Ray, and welcome back to you watching at home. This is GB News Live, and let's talk sport now with Aidan McGee, who's returned to the studio to tackle some more of the big sports stories of the day.
Yeah, Aidan, we can let's talk to you a little bit more about this safe standings trial. First time in 27 years in the top flight in English football, there's going to be fans standing in the terraces. Is that right? When this trial starts at Stamford Bridge later today?
Yeah, most terracing was outlawed from about 1994 onwards, but there were still a few stragglers after that because there were teams that were promoted and they were given a bit more time. I remember going to Burnden Park in Bolton in about 1997. I think that might have been the last time there was standing at ground, but I might have to check that for later on. But yeah, so Chelsea, I mean, you can see the pictures now. It's not terracing as we remember it as kids. I mean, it's rail seating. You can flip those frames down so that you can get out of your way and just watch from a seat if you like. So it's fully mobile in that kind of sense, but it doesn't look anything like the cracked, rickety terracing we were used to as kids back in the 80s and 90s. But it's being trialled at the moment for the rest of the season at certain grounds. Chelsea's one of them. That's today. Gets underway with the Liverpool game. I'm surprised they're doing it for such a big game, actually. But that's another story. Man United are going to do it as well. Manchester City, Tottenham, and in the Championship, they're going to trial it down at Cardiff. So these are in modern stadiums. I mean, Chelsea's interesting because that there are parts of that ground that look no different. The East Stand, for example, doesn't look any different to how it did in the 80s. In fact, it nearly bankrupted the club when they built it back in 1973.
Right.
But Cardiff, for example, Tottenham, they're all new stadiums, so they're going to be experiencing standing for the first time. I don't think the experience will be the same as it was back 30-odd years ago. But
is that a good thing?
Yes and no. I mean, listen, I'm probably harking back to a halcyon era of my youth, but it was so much fun going to standing, and it was the roof that made the noise as well. And there's often a feeling as well, real football fans who went to matches in the 80s and 90s would say that the abolition of standing, or the outlaw, or the phasing out of standing, if you like, was a bit of a red herring for the game's administrators or the game's powers wanting to move the game into a different era economically, commercially. Now, back in the 80s, the aim was to, I mean, you could turn up and watch a game. My first game, January the 18th, 1986 at QPR, £2. I paid to get in, right? So the aim then, probably 2 or 3 years on from that, 3 years later, Hillsborough happened. From there, the aim from owners of Premier League clubs or old First Division clubs then would be to try and hit that mark of charging £20 for a ticket. It seemed back then to be out of this world. They got there probably around about the late 90s, but they were never going to get there unless they were selling a seat. You had no hope of charging a fan £20 to get in if you're selling a standing space. You just couldn't do it. Even allowing for the fact that standing would allow more fans to come in, you would still not.
You wouldn't make that money.
It wasn't palatable, but you had to be selling a seat, and I think a lot of people felt that standing wasn't to blame for the Hillsborough. There were lots of things at play. There was policing, there was stewarding, there was a slow emergency response. Some would criticise supporters as well for the way they behaved on the day. This has its controversial view, but people have said that in the past. But looking at it now, I would say that it's going to be totally different. It's not the standing that we recognise. It was the fences that, in my view, it was fences that caused that problem. There would have been no problem with full open dispersal on that day at Hillsborough or anywhere else where there were flashpoints if the fencing hadn't been there. And those fences, don't forget, they straddled the perimeter of the ground. There were probably openings every few hundred yards, or every 30 yards or whatever. It wasn't enough to get rid of all the excess supporters in that enclosure.
And this will be a very emotional decision for the families of those who died at the Hillsborough disaster. And I suppose some of them will be asking why the need to stand at football games and why now?
Well, the timing now, I guess it's the passage of time. I mean, it's been mooted now for probably 10 years that this would come back. It's not really that new. We all knew what it would look like if it ever returned. Celtic trialled it 3 years ago. They still got it at Parkhead. But I suppose with fans being locked out for most of the last 18 months, we've not really seen it in its full glory, if you like. I would also say that certain clubs would have resisted it because they were very happy with the status quo. This is why it's quite poignant that Chelsea are doing it today. They're one of the clubs who benefited more in the Premier League era than anybody else. They're the ones who've been selling tickets at sometimes £100 for a ticket in the West Stand Upper, for example. Other clubs as well, I don't really see their motivation for doing it, but I think there's a feeling among supporters that there should be choice for football fans. Maybe there's a generation of fans below the age of 30 who've missed out on the experience of standing. But it's not going to be the same. You're not going to be able to jostle around. I mean, I was telling you offset, wasn't I, about how I went to a Chelsea game back in 1992.
Yeah, it's mad.
I was like 15 and I celebrated a goal Not too much. I'm not a Chelsea fan, but I remember.
You were just with the Chelsea fans.
I was carried.
So you had to.
When everything settled down, the game restarted. I realised that in the whole melee and the whole maelstrom of all the celebrations, my body had been transported about 20 feet to another spot without me even realising. It was absolute mayhem. It was like a zoo.
Yeah. But some people obviously. I mean, you found that fun. Some people didn't.
No. But listen, back then you had a change.
Yeah.
You could sit at Stamford Bridge, for example. I mean, it was a different environment. It was basically a Greyhound Stadium. That's what it was. It was so far away from the pitch, the perimeter. You had cars parked behind the goal. I mean, I can show you pictures of that. It's barely believable.
It is,
but you still had the choice. You could spend a few more quid and go into the East Stand and sit. You could go in the benches, which are on the left-hand side. At QPR as well, West Ham, you always had option. There's never been a time that I can remember. I've never known an all-terracing stadium.
Yeah.
So they're always the choice. And I think that traditional football fans would want to see the choice coming back. And fans will make their own mind up. If they don't like standing or they don't like safe standing, they can go and sit somewhere else.
Yeah.
And if it phased out and they find they're not selling spaces in that area, they'll soon go back. And it's not like you have to rebuild or knock down a stand to convert something back to seating. You can just take the rails out.
Yeah.
These were put up in a space of a couple of weeks. You can easily take them away. A break between one game and another, you can remove them. So it's fully mobile, it's adaptable, and that's why we're trialling it, because if it doesn't work, we can go back to type.
Aidan, let's talk about the darts. New Year wouldn't be New Year without the darts at Ali Pali. What's happening this weekend?
It's unbelievable. I mean, I covered it back in 2004. It was just getting back on its feet. It had relatively recently had multi-million viewers, multi-million audiences in the multi-millions back in the 80s. It died a death, really, in the early 2000s. And then
Barry Hearn helped to reinvigorate it, didn't he?
Massively.
As he did with snooker.
Well, he did, and darts allowed itself to be modernised as well.
Yeah.
And I remember covering it in the mid-2000s and really helped giving it a real push, as I was discussing offset earlier. Last night we saw we saw the quarterfinals. Gerwyn Price, a bit of an upset. He got a 9-darter, but he's a champion, and he was put out by Michael Smith. Michael Smith plays tonight in the semi-final against James Wade. Gary Anderson is also in action against the 2020 champion Peter Wright. But yeah, it's become such a major event. I mean, everyone's talking about it. You were saying early on, you were out last night and someone said to you, the darts is well worth going to. I would fully recommend it to anybody. But there was a little bit of controversy as well, because, I mean, we see a lot of celebrities there now.
Yeah.
Last night we saw 3 Leicester players.
Yeah.
Harvey Barnes, Kiernan Dewsbury Hall. I thought Dewsbury Hall was actually a stately home, but...
It sounds like it, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does a little bit.
Does sound like
and James Maddison were there, and earlier in the day, obviously, Leicester's game was postponed.
Yeah, so I thought they'd nip over to the Arrows.
Yeah, well, not nip over. I mean, they've come down from Leicester. I mean, it's not exactly a hop, skip and a jump on a tram.
Well, this is true. Is it a sport or is it a game?
I had this argument. I was on 5 Live about 10 years ago. I think it's if F1 is a sport and if golf is a sport, darts has to be a sport.
Does it involve? But I guess what you could say is that with golf, less so, but definitely Formula One.
You can be 30 stone.
There's a degree
you can be 30
of
stone and win a golf tournament.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Because my argument was going to be obviously.
I'm doing a disservice.
Is it a sport?
25 stone, but
if athleticism is involved, it's a sport. That's the argument often.
Yeah, fine. So what about is F1? Is there a lot of athleticism involved in that?
Yeah, I think so. To withstand the G-forces in the cars, apparently a lot of the drivers have to put themselves through proper fitness routines.
I don't want to bring culture wars into a Sunday morning, but I always felt one of my arguments was that golf and F1 attracted blue chip sponsorship and appealed to middle class people.
Yeah.
Darts was played in social clubs, and so it was looked down upon, and therefore it was.
That's interesting.
It is. I mean, you don't see booze around. You see it in the crowd. Don't get me wrong, you really do. But you don't see booze in view of the play anymore.
Yeah.
Back in the 80s and 90s, I mean, you'd see players. They're just about to throw a dart, and I thought, oh no, actually, I need a quick swig of my pint.
Yeah.
And they go back to there and take it. You don't see that anymore. They've kind of moved on from that. They still drink, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But they've moved it away from screens. So they made it more palatable to a family audience. But I would still argue, with the level of skill and dexterity involved in darts and that hand-eye coordination. I spoke to Phil Taylor many years ago. He basically had a bunker at his house in Stoke-on-Trent. Yeah. He would go down there and practice for 8 hours a day. And he would just do the hand-eye coordination, repetition, like that, to the point where he could not miss.
Wow.
Now, what was interesting was that I said, well, what about the crowd on the day? He goes, tell you what, the crowd can turn up and put me off as much as they want, and they can distract me as much as they want. But when I've been doing that 8 hours a day for 300
he's in the zone.
Days, he's in the zone. How can he miss? And that's why practice on penalties is so important. Anyone says practice doesn't make perfect is really wrong.
Yeah, practice makes progress.
Yes.
as someone once told me.
Exactly. Yeah, I think you're right. But yeah, so in answer to your question, I would always advocate it being a sport, as is snooker.
Aidan, thanks so much. You've been brilliant this morning. That's Aidan McGee, our sports journalist, with all of the latest sports stories.
Yeah, coming up, the one and only Liam Halligan has his best interviews. Difficult to pick, but there is a selection of best interviews with Britain's top business leaders and policymakers discussing their careers. All that to come after the latest weather.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Looking ahead to tomorrow's weather, and the UK is looking to get off to a mild but breezy and in places very showery start. The southwest of England will begin Sunday dry with some bright spells, although there will be a bit of a southwesterly breeze, which will take the edge off the mild feel. The southeast will be cloudier with quite a gusty wind blowing, and 1 or 2 showers are also on the cards here. Overnight rain will have just cleared to the east of Wales come the morning, and so it's looking mainly dry with the sun appearing in places. A different story, though, as we head to northwest England, as showery rain will still be clearing from these parts, with drier conditions beginning to tuck in from the west. A pretty wet start is likely in Newcastle and the rest of the northeast of England. A few heavy bursts of rain are possible, although here the wind will be a little lighter than elsewhere. Whilst blustery showers are likely towards the north and west, most southern and eastern parts of Scotland should get off to a fine start, with fairly mild temperatures and some sunshine. For Northern Ireland, a mixed bag of weather is expected. There'll be some bright weather, but with a few blustery showers also sweeping in from the west. Through the remainder of the morning, most eastern areas will become dry and bright, whilst further showers feed in across the west.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital